Okay, everybody, welcome back. In this video, I want to walk you through some basic editing techniques and go over some of the editing tools, some of the additional editing tools that you'll be able to find in the Develop module in Lightroom. We've been over the Basic tab, so we'll go over that again, but I want to get into some of the other tools, like the color correction tools and the sharpening tools. So I'm just going to go through some of the images that I took for the camera control assignment. I'll walk you through what I think needs to be done with them and tell you about some of the tools that I will use to accomplish that. So let's go ahead and start first with this image, sorry, not that image, this image, our shallow depth of field shot that we took of the water droplet on the end of the mulberry here. So I'm gonna select that image, and I'm just gonna click on the Develop module here, and that'll bring up our Develop tab. So let me just hide my video here so you can see everything I'm doing. So the first thing I noticed about this image is that it's a little bit too dark overall. I need to bring up my exposure. So I'm going to go into the Basic tab. I'm just going to bring my exposure slider up just a bit, maybe something like that. Right about there looks pretty good. And then remember, we want to jump down to these highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks slider. So the first thing I want to do is set my white point and set my black point. And I can do that by holding down the Option key, clicking on the white slider, and then as you can see, once I click on the slider, everything goes black. But as I slide my slider to the right, some points of light start appearing. That means that as I'm bringing my whites up, those areas that are appearing as a white area are actually going pure white in the image. So I just want to back that down until those areas just disappear, right about there. And now I have my white point set. The brightest area of the image is up here in the top, but it's not quite fully white. Another area is right here on the edge of this droplet. It's not quite fully white, but that has set the white point contrast in this image. And then I'll do the exact same thing with the blacks. So again, hold down the Option key, click on the black slider, and pull it down until I see maybe, 5% of the image or so, maybe less, 2% of the image, start to have these black points appear. And then I'll let that go. And that means we have a true black point. I think that that's starting to look pretty good. I might go a little bit further with the blacks. Depends on how much contrast you want. You can see that the yellow areas that are showing up, that means that the clipping in the blue channel. And as you can see in my histogram up here, my blue channel is being pushed off to the side. There's only clipping in the blue channel. So I think I can afford to go a little bit darker with those until I actually see some real black appear, where I have these real black points appearing up on the stem of the tree there. That's where it's gone fully black. It's not just the one channel clipping, but it's all of them. So I'll back it off just a bit, but I think that looks pretty good. And you can see up here in the stem, I have a fully black area. But as you can see, the contrast now in the main portion of the image is much better. So I can click my backslash button to show you the before. There's the after. So I just brought in a lot more contrast, a lot more separation in the image. The whole thing was there, now it's there. So you can see that just kind of haziness, that almost brown haziness disappears from the image. And then I can use my highlights and shadow slider to kind of fine tune how I want my tonal ranges to be. So I could bring up my highlights maybe a little bit. If I want to give a little bit more brightness in the brighter areas, maybe bring down my shadows for more contrast, or potentially up my shadows. If you want more detail in the shadow area, it's sort of image dependent what you want to do. I think with this image, it looks good right about there. So I went plus in my highlights and in my shadows. And then I just want to come back and double check my white slider to make sure I'm not blowing something out too hard when I adjusted my highlights. And I did actually blow out that top area. So I'll bring it down just to there. And now I have my contrast back. So again, start, finish, not a huge difference, but enough to just make the image that much more clear and that much more nice looking. From there, I'll go down into my presence tab, so my texture, clarity, and dehaze. And I probably just want to bring my clarity up just a bit. And you can see as I go up, this is too much, but you can see as I go up, I'm getting a lot more color separation, a lot more contrast in the colors of the image. So I probably want to go up maybe somewhere around 20 on the clarity. And then I can bring my texture up too if I want a little bit more detail in the main droplet area. So that's without texture. That's bringing my texture up just a little bit, and you can see the edge of the leaf and all of these little tiny details up here got a lot more clear. So again, before, after, before, after, and it's starting to look a lot better now. Okay, we can do some vibrance or saturation. I already think that the green's pretty punchy, so I don't think I really need any more saturation on the greens. I could see if I bring my vibrance up, too much, I think. So I'm gonna set that to where it was. Saturation, I think probably could stand maybe a tiny little bit more, like 5 + 5 maybe on the saturation, but even that's starting to get a little bit on the heavy side. So before, after, I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, so that's it for the basic tab. We could do some color temperature stuff if we want to. If I think that green is a little bit much, I could add in some magenta to kind of bring it back down and bring some of those warm tones out. Now it's a little too warm, so I can bring some cool tones back in. Maybe something like that looks good. So I just added a little bit of magenta and a little bit of blue to dial down some of that green just a bit. But I think overall, that looks pretty good. Okay, now let's move down to the tone curve tool. To start with, I think it's more helpful to be in the kind of other side of this tool. So right now, it's just a regular tone curve tool like you would use in Photoshop, where you put points on the line and pull them up or down to do what you want to do. I don't really like working with this. Whoops. I accidentally deleted the image rather than the point. There we go. Now I can reset this by double clicking here on that point, double clicking on that point. All right, back to where we started. I don't recommend using the tool in this way if you're new to Lightroom or new to Photoshop, because it's a little bit more abstract, the way you have to think about it. It's all about manipulating this line to kind of create the effect you want. So making a curve like this adds like a ton of contrast, but that is not an easy way to work with this tool. The easier way to work with this tool is if you click on the square in the bottom right-hand corner of this tool, the tone curve tool, then that'll switch over to this slider view. And you, again, have highlights, lights, darks, and shadows that you can manipulate with sliders. And you can see how it moves the curve up above, but you don't actually manipulate the line. This is an easier way to familiarize yourself with this tool rather than trying to manipulate the line yourself from scratch. And then once you sort of understand how this tool works, then you can jump over to the other side, which is manipulating the line with points. But for now, I would prefer if you guys stay in the slider part. And again, this is similar to the highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks tool that you have up in the basics tab, but it's just an additional point of control. So if you get that kind of where you like it, but you just want to do a little bit more work in the contrast or the exposure, you can come down into the tonal curve tool and do it separately. So again, I might decide to bring my kind of lights up a bit here, maybe. I think that looks pretty good. Brings a little bit more separation out of the little kind of hairs on the mulberry. And then maybe lights up a bit. Probably bring my darks. I'll leave my darks where they're at. And then my shadows. Maybe I'll bring my shadows down just a bit to give it a little bit tiny bit more contrast. With all of these tools, except for the basic tab, you have this little toggle switch, right? So where it says tone curve, next to it, you have this kind of toggle on and off switch. If I click that, it turns that tool off. If I click it back on, it turns it on. So you can see that's just what I've done with the tone curve tool. And I think that that looks pretty good. I'm noticing that this area up here is getting a little bit more blown out again. So I probably need to come back into my white slider in the basics tab and just readjust that a little bit more, bring it down a bit so it's not quite blowing out there. And then probably need to bring my highlights down a little bit too. But that looks pretty good. Now you can see from there to there, just a little bit more fine-tuned contrast and control. Okay, from there, I'm going to collapse these other windows so it's a little bit less distracting. I'm going to come into my HSL and color tool. So HSL stands for hue, saturation, and luminance. And this is your main color correcting tool. So in the basics tab, you have your color temperature and tint, which is your white balance. But if you want to break out individual colors, so say I want to change the way this green kind of shows up or renders, I need to come into the HSL tool. So hue controls the hue of the image. So you know, pushing the greens more towards the warm or the cool end. And I'll show you this in a second. Then you have saturation, which is how intensely those colors are registered. Then you have luminance, which is the brightness of those colors. So I can make the greens lighter or darker. So I'm gonna start in hue, and notice that we have all of our various color sliders. So we have red, orange, yellow, green, aqua, blue, purple, and magenta. If I start messing around with, say, the green slider, it'll affect the greens, and I can push it more towards the warm tones or more towards the cool tones, and it's only changing the greens in my image. Notice how the kind of red little stick that's on this leaf isn't changing when I move this slider. So you can do it by color, but the easier way to use this tool, and the way that I think you guys should start using this tool, is with this little circle tool right here. It's like this little sample tool. So if I click on that, it becomes active, and when I go over my image, you can see it's kind of come with me. It's come with my cursor. Now the cool thing about this is, if you're not sure like what color range this particular leaf is, it's kind of green, it's kind of yellow, it's a little bit of both, what you can do is just grab that tool, the sampler tool, come over the leaf, and then click and hold, and then if you drag your mouse down, you can see it's changing, or if you push up, it's changing towards the cool tone. So it's sampling that color, and it's moving the appropriate sliders. And as you see, as I pull this down, it's moving both the yellow and the green slider, but it's moving them sort of differently. It's moving more of the yellow and less of the green. So that tells me that that leaf was a little bit more yellow than green, but it is a little bit of both. So if I want them to be a cooler green, I can, again, push up. If I want them to be a warmer green, I can sort of push down. I think I would like them to be maybe a slightly cooler green, something like that. And then you notice there's a very small adjustment, +3 in the yellow, +1 in the green. And then I can go through these other areas of my image. So I have this area that's kind of more of a brown. And if I want that to go a little bit more red or orange or something, I can again click in this area, pull down, or push up to either make it more towards the greens or more towards the reds. Now, I think maybe slightly more towards, actually you could probably stay where it's at, maybe slightly more towards the reds. But you know, I'm not crazy about what's happening with this separation right here. As I pull it more towards the warm tones, it's kind of creating this kind of hard, choppy line. So I'm going to undo that, and I'll go back in my history here in order to undo that. I'll just walk it back. Maybe about here. I think here is where I made my last change. And I'm going to actually deal with this in just the sliders, because when I sample this, becomes this kind of weird separation where this green turns to brown, and it makes that that division, that line, a little bit more noticeable, whereas in the original image it's a pretty nice continuous change. So I'm just going to grab my orange slider here. I'm going to play with that and see if I can't bring some of that orange value back in, and maybe in my yellows bring that down just a bit. See, my yellows is where the problem is happening. So I don't want to do too much in the yellows, maybe just about there. And in order to keep that green value that I liked in my leaves, I might need to push that green back a little bit more towards cool. So something like that. But what I'm trying to do is get a better separation between my green tones and my warm tones in the image, so that this leaf and things like the warms in the background kind of pop off a little bit better. And then the last thing I want to do is I have this kind of blue area here, whitish blue. And I think I'd like that to render a little bit more blue, so I have more colors overall in the image. So I'm going to, again, take that tool, come over to my blues here, and then this blue region. I'll take that and I'll just push it maybe kind of more towards the cyan spectrum of things, so that I get a little bit more of that cool value. And maybe that's a little too much, just something like that. So if I click this tool on and off, again, the HSL tool, you can see that's where I started and that's where I finished up. It's very subtle, but it just adds a little bit more color and interest into the image. And I think I like the way that looks. Now, saturation. Once you've got your colors kind of pegged in terms of how they relate to each other, you want to move up to the saturation tool, and the saturation tool controls how kind of vibrant or how punchy those colors are. So I think that this green is maybe a little bit too much. So I'm gonna, again, grab my selector tool or my sampler tool. I'll click in the greens and I'll just bring that saturation down just a bit, make it look a little bit more natural. Something like that, probably. That looks a whole lot more natural than it had previously. So that was before I did my color adjustments, and that's after I brought that green saturation down. You can see all that sort of glowiness from the greens kind of comes down and makes everything look a whole lot more realistic, a whole lot more natural. I'll probably do the same with this cyan area, just because I think it's a little bit too punchy. Like that would be overly saturated. I bring this down. It goes more towards neutral slightly, but still has that nice kind of pop to it. Little extra bit of cyan in the tones there. And then what I can do actually is kind of bring my reds back up. So I think that those reds got a little bit too muted. If I bring them back up, particularly where this leaf is, then I can make those reds separate off again, and I have more kind of tonal range, more color in this image than I had previously. So let's look at it from the beginning. That's where we started. Straight out of the camera, really kind of low contrast, low color, all of it's like kind of a little bit too greenish yellow overall, and that's where we got to after those adjustments. So again, before, after, before, after. And particularly if you guys look in the top of this mulberry and this leaf right here, you can see I've done a lot just to make that a whole lot more clear, a lot more contrasty, a lot more good color separation. Okay, let's keep moving. After the HSL tool, we have a split toning tool, which comes in handy sometimes, not necessarily all the time. But the way that this works is it allows you to give a color cast to the highlights and a color cast to the shadows separately. So sometimes this is used to fix problems in the image. So let's say if you have too much green in the shadows, you can add a magenta hue, because magenta is the opposite of green, into just the shadows without affecting the highlights, or vice versa. So you notice in each section, you have your highlights up here, and then you have a hue and a saturation slider, and then you have a shadow section with a hue and a saturation slider. So the way that this works is you define a color. Your hue is the color that you want to put in. You see it goes from yellow all the way to magenta. And then the saturation is effectively how much of that color you put into the shadows. So you can do it through the sliders. You can say select cyan to bring it to the highlights, and then bring up the saturation to add more or less cyan into the highlights. But maybe an easier way to do it is if you click in this gray rectangle that's next to the word highlight or next to the word shadows, that brings up a color picker tool. So effectively what this is a visualization of those two sliders. So left to right, you have hue. So red, orange, yellow, green, cyan, blue, magenta, and then back to red. And then the up and down is the saturation, how much of it to put in. So right now I have cyan picked, but since my selection is down in the very, very bottom, there's no saturation being put in. You can just click at different points within this frame and you can see what it would look like. So I'm adding yellow to the highlights right now, and I'm adding quite a bit of it because I'm up there. If I wanted a little bit less yellow, I would just move down and click down until I have the tonal value that I like. Now, I'm not sure I really need any split toning in this image. I can play around with it. I kind of like how it looks with maybe a little bit of orange in the highlights. Let's see, red. No, not red. Yeah, I like it with a little bit of orange in the highlights, I think. And then I'll close that. And if I go into the shadows, usually you want to kind of work on the opposite. That's where split toning, that's why it's called split toning. You split between the highlights and the shadows. So the opposite of orange is sort of more in the blue range. So if I add blue to the shadows, how's that look? And I'm not crazy about it. Maybe actually it looks a little bit better with kind of bluish magenta in the shadows. And then again, a relatively low saturation. So we can see if we like this. So again, I'll turn the split toning off and on. So that was before, that was after. I actually sort of do like what that's doing, is taking that green down just a little bit more and adding a little bit more warmth into the background. I think it's probably a little bit too strong in the magenta and the shadows. So I'll take that down in the saturation slider just a bit, maybe down to 12. And same with the highlights. I think the effect is just a little too strong overall. But let's see now. That was before, that was after. And I think I like the way that looks. Again, it's just giving more separation into the scene allowing us to get a lot more color separation, a lot more color detail. Okay, so that's split toning. Detail is your sharpness, and detail is a really helpful tool if you need to sharpen your image or if you need to get rid of noise. So the way this works, you want to zoom in to 100%, and then you have a sharpening, radius, detail, and masking slider. So this is a really, really powerful tool. So what you want to do is you want to look for an area that is sharp in the image. So I'm going to look at my mulberry here, and then I'm going to start moving the amount slider up to the right, and you can see it's going to get more and more sharp. If I go really far, you can see it's sharpened a ton. If I back it off a bit, then you can see it's just sharpening a little bit. How much you sharpen is really going to be dependent on your camera, and it should be pretty much the same every time. A raw file will come out of your camera with a little bit of softness to it inherently. So every file that comes out of your camera should apply about the same amount of sharpening to it when you're in Lightroom. So you'll figure out sort of what numbers work best. I know for this particular camera, around 60 or so on the sharpening looks pretty good. And then the radius is 1 pixel. So the radius is looking for details, how big of details to sharpen. And I'm trying to give it a 1 radius, which means 1 pixel. So it's looking for 1 pixel detail to sharpen. If you slide it up, you'll see your sharpening gets kind of more and more chunky. So I recommend leaving it down around 1. I think 1 is a nice kind of natural look for it. Your detail slider, again, just kind of looks for more additional details to sharpen. But I think, again, its default is 25, and that's usually pretty good. So I would just leave it right about there. Now, masking is the really cool thing. So if you guys notice, I'll go to 3:1. I have a lot of noise in this image. I mean, not a lot, but there is noise. And particularly, there's noise in the background where I've gone this really nice kind of soft focus. And the sharpening tool is sharpening that noise in the background. So that's without the sharpening tool, that's with the sharpening tool. And you can see it's bringing out quite a bit of noise in the background. So what the mask tool does is it allows you to create a mask that only sharpens the areas that you want to sharpen. So in this case, the sharp detail, and it does not sharpen the kind of blurry areas. So let me show you how this works. This is very, very cool. Again, you want to hold down the Option button on your keyboard, just like you did with the white point and your black point. And then you're going to grab that masking slider and you're going to push it over to the right. And as you push it over to the right, you're going to see there's these black areas that appear in your image and white areas that appear in your image. So the way the mask works is that anything that's black, it's not applying the sharpening to that area. Anything that's white, it will apply the sharpening to that area. So I want to push my masking slider all the way until my whole background, the area that I don't want to sharpen, goes black, something like that. And now you can see it's only sharpening the areas that have the sharpest detail in the image. Now, if I let go of that slider, you can see that I don't have as big of a problem with the noise in the background anymore as I did before. And if I click on and off the sharpening tool, you can see it's sharpening the mulberry here, just the edges that need sharpened, but it's not sharpening the background very much. The other thing that this tool can do is reduce noise. So you notice I have noise reduction down here. In the background, there is some noise, and in particular, there was color noise. So again, let me turn off this detail tool. And you guys can see I have this kind of orange and green splotchiness in the back. Let me go 4:1 so you can see it even better. So I have this kind of orange and green noise. That's just noise from the digital camera that is caused from basically the different colored pixels rendering differently. So if I click the detail tool on, you can see I already have some color noise reduction put on, 25%, but I can bring that up even further and get rid of that noise entirely, maybe to like 50% or so. And so you can see when I click this on and off, all that color noise in the background goes away. And then the luminance noise reduction deals with just these little dark and light spots that are in the background. That's at 0 right now, but I can bring that up and it'll help smooth that out a bit, maybe just to around 25. Now you need to be careful with the luminance tool because it can also tend to unsharpen your image in the areas that you're trying to sharpen. So as you bring your luminance noise reduction up, you need to be careful and look at your detail areas to make sure you're not actually softening those out. But I think we're still doing a good job with our sharpness. And so about 25% on the luminance looks pretty good. So I'm gonna leave it there, but you can see I have this really nice sharp image now where my water droplet is and where my detail on the mulberry is. So that's good for the detail tool. Now, the last thing I want to show you is your lens correction tools. So the cool thing about Lightroom and about raw images is that one of the metadatas that it includes is information about your lens. So if I click on Enable Profile Corrections, it recognizes my lens and it applies a correction based on the known distortion from that lens. So it's telling me I'm using the Canon EF 50mm made by Canon, and then it applies a profile for that particular lens. And you can see I click this off. I have this sort of curvature out the corners of my image. If I click it on, it kind of fixes that curvature. So again, that's off and that's on. So it's a good idea to enable profile corrections in your image. And then the other thing that these can do is that option for remove chromatic aberrations. Now, I don't have a big problem with that in this image, but what typically you'll see if you shoot a picture of something that's dark against something that's bright, so like leaves of a tree against a bright sky, you'll get this kind of color fringing on the edge, this kind of purplish green little ridge around the details in your image. Like I said, I don't have any here, but I can probably show you another image where it does exist, in which case that remove chromatic aberrations is a really, really strong tool. It just gets rid of all that ugliness and makes it look a lot nicer. So I always recommend putting remove color or remove chromatic aberration and enable profile corrections on your image. It's going to be really helpful for you. Okay, and then the last thing I want to show you is down on the effects tab. So in our effects tab, we have the ability to put in a little bit of vignetting. And what vignetting is adding a little bit of darkness to the corners of the image. And the reason why this is helpful is because it can bring focus back in to the center of the image where it should be. So in this case, I have my water droplet and my mulberry in the center of the image, but I have these kind of lighter values out here at the edge. And your eye just typically goes to the lightest area of the image. When I'm looking at this image, my eye is kind of drawn down here, even though I want it to be drawn up here. So what I can do is add some vignetting in to darken this area to bring my eye more back towards the center. So the way you do that is with this amount slider right here. And I'm going to pull it to the left to add darkness into the corners. And as I go, you can see it's making it much darker. If you go really far, you can see it makes a really extreme version. I don't want to do that, but I probably do want to come down maybe to about there, maybe like 18 or so. And you can see it's just darkening these areas down a bit and is pulling my attention back into the center here where it belongs. And if I click that on and off, you can see that's before the vignette and that's after the vignette. So it just helps focus the attention back on the image here. Okay, the last thing I want to do with this image is, again, I want to brighten this up a little bit more in the middle because I still think that this leaf is pulling the most attention and I really want the eye to be here. So I'm going to go into my local adjustment tools, which I uploaded a bunch of videos on how these work. So I recommend that you watch those for a more in-depth tutorial on how these work. But I'm going to add a circle of brightness kind of right in here just to brighten this up a little bit and bring my attention back in the center there. So I'm going to grab my radial adjustment tool, which is this circle. I'll open it up. And remember, we have basically our basic tab that is all effects that we can apply inside the circle. I'm going to reset this for now. I'm going to click the invert button because in this case, I want to apply the effect inside the circle rather than outside the circle. So I'll click invert and that'll make sure that whatever I do is applied inside the circle. And then I'm just going to add some plus exposure just to start, like maybe one full stop of exposure. And then what I'll do is I'll draw my circle. So I'll click and drag and draw the circle. And you can see it's brighter inside the circle and darker outside of it. Now that's too much, but I do want to see where I want to position it. So I'm going to kind of position it maybe right about there. I'm gonna actually make it a little bit smaller so it doesn't go on that other leaf, which I'm trying to avoid. And then I'll unclick my slider here. Now I know I have the circle where I want it, and now I can start playing with how much I want to bring back in. Maybe just about that, maybe there. And then I could probably add a little bit of contrast as well, just to make that center area kind of pop a little bit more. So I think that ultimately that looks pretty good. And now I have a little bit more brightness and a little bit more focus here back on the center rather than my eye being pulled over to this leaf over here. So I think that's about all I'm gonna do with this image. And again, if I go from start to finish, you can see I've done quite a bit of editing on it, just small little incremental steps to get me from something that was okay, but ultimately really, really low contrast and pretty kind of washed out to something that looks really nice and poppy. Okay, so let's go do one more image so I can show you some other cool little techniques. I'm gonna jump over to this image of my daughter here that I took in our garage. It's a nice little portrait, and it's got a nice soft background, and I think the light looks really good on her, but I wanted to make some adjustments just so I can separate her a little bit more off the background and give us a little more interest and pop. So again, I'm gonna start back up at the basics tab, and I'm just gonna deal with my kind of overall exposure. So I'll probably bring it down just a bit, something like that. And then I'm gonna play with my highlights a bit, bring my highlights back up to make her face pop out a little bit more. Maybe my shadows can go down a little bit to, again, to create more separation between her and the background. And then I'll set my white point and my black point. So I'll bring my whites up just until we don't clip. That looks pretty good. Maybe back it off just a little bit. And then my blacks, I wanna bring down to about there or so. And now we've done basically our exposure and contrast. So I can show you before, after. And you can see how much more it just brings the focus into her face and eliminates some of that background a little bit more. I think I can bring the shadows down probably even more to make that background go away a bit more. Okay, before, after, yeah, that looks pretty good. Now, the next thing I want to do is play with the texture and clarity. So I could probably add a little bit of texture in here just to bring out some of the, her eyelashes and some of the detail in her eye, not too much. And then for the clarity, I probably want to bring that down a little bit actually, just to soften her skin out a bit. When you're doing portraits of people, especially little kids who have like kind of really smooth skin, it's helpful to bring the clarity down a bit just so it eliminates some of the little textures and things on their skin and kind of softens it out. So I think that looks pretty good. Probably go even a little bit more on the minus clarity, maybe a little bit less texture as well. Down to +9, down on the clarity a little bit more, something like that. Okay, yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and skip over the tone curve tool for right now, and I want to jump down to the HSL tool. And what I want to do is just look at the colors in the image. So we have these blues in her sweater, we kind of have the red tones in her lips and her skin, and then we have the blues and greens in her eyes. I just want to make those colors pop a little bit more, because remember, the raw files come out of the camera just a little bit more dull than they would otherwise. So I'm going to start with my hue tool. I'm going to grab that selector tool, and I'm going to start on her lips, and I'm going to play with the hue. So if I go up, it pushes it more towards the yellows and greens. If I go down, it pushes it more towards kind of the reds and purples. So I think just down slightly to bring that a little bit more towards the reds. And then I will grab some of the blues from her sweaters, and I can push that either more towards cyan or more towards the dark blues. I think I'm going to leave that right about kind of where it is actually. I think that blue looks pretty good. I'll just deal with that in the saturation tool in a minute. And then I think her eyes look basically fine. Yeah, we're going to leave those where they are. We're going to deal with the eyes separately later on with a radial adjustment tool. Okay, so not much there, but I do want to go into the saturations now and deal with the saturation in her sweater and in her skin. So let's first move down to her sweater, and we'll grab the saturation tool and we'll just bring some of that saturation up a bit. Just bring that blue up, maybe to about there. And same with the lips, bring the saturation up just a bit to about there. Again, we'll deal with the eyes separately. I can probably bring them up just a little bit, maybe like that. So if you look at what we did in the HSL tool, it's not a lot, but it's just giving it a little bit more color separation, particularly in that sweater, to make the colors a little bit more vibrant and punch a little bit better. Okay, now, the main work I want to do is on her eyes. I want her eyes to punch a little bit more, have a little bit more contrast, a little bit more color, and a little bit more sharpness. And so the way I'm going to do that is with a radial adjustment tool. So I'm going to grab the radial tool, and I'm going to draw a circle over her eye there to about like that, just over the colored part of her eye. That looks pretty good. Now what I can do is start adding in some color temperature and some contrast, and then some sharpness to bring out all the structure and detail in her eye and give it a little bit more pop. So first thing I'll do is I'll bring my whites up, I'll bring my blacks down, and that's going to give us the contrast that we want, something like that probably. And then I probably want to give it some blue in the color temperature. Not that much. My computer is dragging a little bit, I apologize. Maybe to about there. And then I also want to add some green in, just to give it a little bit more rich color tonality. Something like that. And then I can bring my exposure, I'm going to leave my exposure where it's at for right now. I think what I want to do is add some contrast actually. So I'll bring my contrast slider up, maybe to about there. And then I want to add in some sharpness to sharpen some of those details. And I want to add in some clarity. And when you add the clarity, it tends to darken things up a bit. But that looks pretty good. And then we can actually saturate a little bit too, just to bring some more of that color out. Okay, so if I click this on and off, again, I have this toggle tool at the bottom. You can see I went from that to that. So I just brought a lot more color and contrast and detail into her eyes. And, you know, clicking on and off, I see maybe I've added a little bit too much green. So I'm going to back that green off just a bit to about there. But so I'm not really changing the color. I'm just sort of getting rid of that haziness that was over her eye and bringing out the structure and detail. So once I have that set, what I can do is duplicate it and move the copy over the other eye. So it applies the same effect to the other eye. I may need to reshape the tool just a bit so it applies to the area that I want. And then the last thing I want to do is look at the feather of the tool. I have this feather slider, so what's happening is it's applying the effect 100% in the middle and then fading it out as it gets to the edge. So I can bring that feather down a bit and it'll apply the effect more evenly across the whole eye. I'll do the same thing here. Bring that feather down and you can see it just is affecting the entire eye area a little bit better than it was before. So let me click this on and off so you can see it going from that to that, and just brought her eyes out a ton and made it look a lot better. So let's zoom back out and we can click that on and off again so you can see the full image from there to there. So it just makes the effect a whole lot nicer and look a whole lot better. Okay, what else can we do to this image? I think that the warm tones in her hair are a little bit washed out. So what I can do is I can go back into the HSL tool, grab again the selector tool, and I probably want to be just in saturation in this case, and I'll take my saturation slider and just bring it up a bit here and bring some more of those kind of golden tones back in. I think that looks pretty good. And then the last thing I'll do is come back up into my basics tab and now just kind of reassess the overall color temperature of the image. And I think it's looking a touch on the warm side. So I'll just back that warmth off a bit, give it a little bit more of a cool tonality. I think that that looks pretty good. So that's where we started. That's where we finished. So again, just it makes her come off that background a little bit more, gives her a whole bunch more pop to kind of her eyes and her sweater. It just separates out those warm tones and those cool tones quite a bit better. So that's two approaches to editing two different kinds of images, but you can see some of the tools I used and kind of how they came out. So start applying some of those techniques to your own images, and I'll make some additional tutorials on how to edit, but also take a look at everything that I've put on Canvas, because I've put a ton of videos that have really great editing tutorials and a bunch of really good techniques to try in those videos. So those are going to be really, really helpful to you. So definitely take a look at those additional resources on Canvas, and we'll see you back again soon with another video.